Hey everyone, welcome to this week's reading of Shot of the Sun. Picking back up where we left off last week, so I will just jump right into it. Chapter 6. Broderick rode beside the necromancer. She knew the way, and so he was resigned to just following her lead. He had wanted to retrieve his own horses, but she said they would need a faster way of getting to Ravendale. These horses are for work. We need some for traveling, she had informed him. He didn't think it mattered as long as they were on the road. The stables where he had dropped off his wagon also had horses for sale. When he attempted to pay, the stablemaster refused payment. "I heard what you did for that sick boy," he said with a smile. "It's my honor to help you." Broderick wasn't prone to getting attention from anyone other than beautiful ladies. His blond hair and green eyes were enough to drive a woman mad with lust, but add into that equation his well-muscled body from hard labor. Well, he was lucky to keep their hands off him most times. They traveled in silence most of the day. Broderick didn't mind. He found the necromancer to be an oddity. If it weren't for her peculiar eyes, he might almost find her attractive. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him and he began talking with her. "What happened to your eyes?" She didn't bother looking at him. "Why must you know?" she asked, keeping her gaze ahead. They were several hours away from Muirwood now, with only the occasional small farming community to pass through. I don't have to know if you don't want to talk about it. When we first met, I thought you were blind. That's obviously not the case. When I first summoned a Baylor, I was a novice in my arts. It used its magic to sear my eyes. Over time, my sight returned. Most of it, anyway. She talked about it so casually that Broderick wondered where she got her internal strength from. "What is a Balor?" he asked. "A powerful demon," she answered. "Very tall, massive. I was lucky to dismiss it before it killed me." She remained silent. Broderick thought he saw a pained look cross her features. It was fleeting, and he almost doubted that he even saw it. "People call you the Necromancer. Do you have a real name?" he asked. She scowled at him. "Names are powerful, more than most realize. My name is my own, and if I feel it is necessary to share it with you, I will. Until then, just call me the Necromancer." "Sorry," he said glumly. He stared out at the countryside and realized it was nearing dark. The sun was beginning to set, and the sky took on an almost surreal look. Small wisps of cloud were scattered about, bathed in oranges and reds. The day had been comfortably warm, and Broderick was beginning to feel the effects of not sleeping the night before. "We should find some place to rest," he said, "before it gets too dark to see anything." She nodded in agreement. There were hills nearby, and Broderick could see the dark openings of caves. "There," he pointed. "Caves make a good shelter if it rains, trust me." He chuckled at a distant memory. The necromancer was not amused. "No, we will stay in the open. There are no rain clouds, and there's something about those caves I don't like." Broderick sighed. She was a difficult one. He learned quickly it was pointless to argue with her. He didn't pack much, as he was in a hurry to retrieve his cousin's wife. It was his fault she had been endangered. He pulled the shard from the pouch on his belt. It had brought him a lot of stress lately. He was of a mind to give it away to ensure he got Octavia back to Derek safely. It was the least he could do. He put the shard back and they stopped their horses. Broderick dismounted and pulled a blanket out of the saddle. He unrolled it and laid it on the ground. Leading the horse by the reins to a large dead tree, he wrapped them around a low-hanging branch. There was plenty of grass to graze on. He pulled the xiphos his cousin had given him from the saddle and sheathed it as he lay on his makeshift bed. And unsheathed it. Daylight was slowly fading, but he could still make out the details of the blade. It was a double-edged sword. It was light, well-balanced, and intended to be wielded one-handedly. The metal of the blade was silver in color, but Broderick didn't know what it was made of. Etched down the center of the blade were many runes. He couldn't read any of them. Near the hilt of the blade, there was a single word in the Tommen tongue. It read, Sorandra. The hilt was wood, a deep gray speckled with black. Broderick had seen trees with that odd coloring in the woods around his home. When he asked his cousin where he had gotten such a beautiful weapon, his cousin said it had been in the family for years. He sheathed the weapon and looked to see what the necromancer was doing. She had tied her horse beside his, and also made a bed out of a single blanket. Her back was to him. He thought about attempting to talk to her some more, but decided he was too tired. His eyes were heavy, and he was having trouble keeping them open. Sleep took him quickly. The necromancer waited until she knew Broderick was asleep. The night was silent, and she heard his breathing slow. She got up and grabbed a sack from the saddle of her horse. She walked around the other side of the tree and laid the bag down, and silently crept over to where Broderick was sleeping. His chest moved up and down rhythmically. Kneeling down, she withdrew the shard from his pouch. He didn't move. She walked back over to the tree and gathered a couple of sticks and set them in a pile, then placed a handful of dry leaves onto the sticks. Opening the sack, she withdrew a piece of firestone. It was gray, and one side had a sharp, acute edge. She pulled a dagger from her boot and stuck the blade into one of the sticks. With her other hand, she began rubbing the firestone against the blade until it heated up. After several strikes, sparks began to fly off the steel. She watched until the sparks hit the grass and it began to smoke. She leaned down and blew gently. A fire sprang to life, igniting the kindling. She quickly added more grass and sat back. She hadn't lit the fire for warmth, for it was almost summer, and the air was temperate and slightly humid. She watched as the flames consumed the sticks and began a small fire. She reached into the folds of her robes and pulled out a small bag containing black powder. Sprinkling just a few grains onto the fire, the flames danced wildly. She waved her hands over the fire and began to chant softly. The flames swayed with the motion of her hands. "Skiram," she called. The flames began to change color. She repeated the name 2 more times. The flames roared up and took the shape of a face. "Skiram," she breathed, "Lord of the Flame." She prostrated herself before the fiery face. "Rise," a voice said from within the fire. She lifted her head. "Tell me, necromancer, why do you summon me?" She had been confident until this moment. Skiram was a demon. He was known as the Lord of the Flame, for only he could be summoned through the element of fire. He was also a master of deceit. She took care when dealing with him. "I have summoned you to ask a favor." The face in the flames remained emotionless. She swallowed hard. She had been summoning otherworldly creatures for years, but Skiram was different. He was powerful, ruthless, and clever. He had tricked her once before, and she refused to be tricked by the demon again. "I'm listening," Skiram said. The necromancer cleared her throat before she spoke. "You know what I seek, and why I seek it," she began. Skiram interrupted her. "I have told you before, I have no power over this matter. Their strength comes from one greater than I." She nodded and tried to be patient. "I know this, but I do not need your help with that. I have something in my possession to handle that." She displayed the shard to the fiery face. Skiram's eyebrows rose. The demon was impressed. "Ancient magic," he said. "I feel it pulsing in your hand. How did you come by it?" She smirked. "That is my secret to keep. What I need is much easier for you, but impossible for me." She laid out her plot in detail, explaining why she needed what she asked of him. Skiram's fiery appearance grinned, and once he even laughed wickedly. The necromancer peered through the tree branches to make sure the sound didn't wake Broderick. She was relieved to see he hadn't moved. "I will grant you what you ask, but you must do something for me." She figured as much, and was prepared to hear the worst. "I require a sacrifice." She nodded her head. "An animal?" she asked. Many demons asked for animal sacrifices, but she had yet to discover the reason. "I am not some lesser spirit who plays God over barbarian tribes," Skiram spat. "I will demand my sacrifice when I choose, and it will be whatever I choose. You will be bound to honor your vow." She considered his words. Aside from her craft, she didn't have much to lose. A petty sacrifice seemed fair. She was getting the better end of this deal by far. "I agree." "Reach into the flames," Skiram commanded. She obeyed in the heat of the fire scorched her flesh. She gasped but kept her hand engulfed until Skiram told her to remove it. A rune of binding was burned into her palm. "To ensure your end of the bargain," the demon told her. She bit her lip against the searing pain and bowed her head. The flames roared up and then went out completely, leaving her temporarily blinded in the dark. She sheathed the dagger back into her boot and replaced everything she had taken from the bag back inside. The necromancer her sack back onto the saddle and was about to lie down to rest when she heard the snapping of a twig. She froze and looked around. Her eyes had yet to readjust to the darkness, but she could see Broderick was still sleeping. She thought it may have been a wild animal. After several moments, she decided it was safe and relaxed upon the blanket she had laid out. Everything is coming together. She closed her eyes to get some sleep. Broderick rolled onto his side and woke up, feeling a rock jabbing him from under the blanket. He grunted and blearily slid his hand under the blanket to remove the rock. The sound gave him pause. He waited and listened to see if he heard it again. Hearing nothing, he was about to go back to sleep when he heard the unmistakable sound of a voice. He looked over at the necromancer, but it seemed to him that she was asleep. He unconsciously held his breath and waited. There it was again. He could hear voices, but they did not speak any language he had heard before. It was guttural and sounded like someone trying to clear their throat. And then he saw them, about 6 small shadows quietly approaching. He slowly wrapped his hand around the hilt of his sword. The moon shone bright, and when the small forms stepped out of the shadows, Broderick involuntarily sucked in a breath. Goblins! Standing between 3 to 3.5 feet tall, they were not an impressive sight. Their skin color ranged from sickly yellow to a deep red. Most goblins didn't weigh more than 50 pounds. Though they were small and light, their strength was startling. A single goblin could rip the limbs off a trained soldier in full armor. From his view, Broderick could see they were all wearing brown-leathered armor. Brown-colored leather, most likely mismatched armor scavenged from their victims. Goblins favored ambushes. Broderick cursed himself for a fool. They should have checked the caves. They were sneaking up on the necromancer. He could see the glint of metal in their hands. 6 armed goblins against him and a woman. He had a sword and was versed enough in its use to hold his own, but what about her? Not having time to formulate a plan, he leaped up and unsheathed his sword. The goblins halted. A man carrying a sword apparently caused them to second-guess themselves. They all looked to the same goblin whom Broderick guessed was their leader. The creature snarled in order, and they began moving toward him. The leader held up a serrated blade and continued walking toward the necromancer. "Wake up!" Broderick shouted, but the necromancer wasn't there. The goblin seemed just as surprised as Broderick. She appeared behind the leader and pressed her dagger to his throat. Her white eyes shone dangerously, and she drove the blade into the creature's flesh. A gurgling sound escaped the goblin's mouth before she pushed him to the ground. Broderick leaped forward and thrust his blade straight ahead at the nearest goblin. He managed to nick it in the shoulder. The others fanned out around him. Goblins are cowardly by nature, but when numbers are on their side, they are able to take down most enemies. Broderick held his sword out before him, slapping aside the goblin's attempts to strike him. It was only a matter of time before they got the idea to rush him. He risked a glance to the necromancer and saw her drawing in the dirt. Well, she wasn't much help. He blocked another strike from a goblin and rushed the creature, swinging a wide arc to try to cut his head off. The goblin backpedaled and tripped, falling onto its back. Broderick twisted the hilt in his hand and drove the blade down into the creature's stomach. It howled in pain and thrashed about. He twisted the blade and turned in time to see a goblin fist crash into the side of his face. His vision blurred momentarily. They're stronger than they look. That moment was all they needed. They howled with fury and rushed him. He went down under a mass of goblin flesh. He punched and kicked in a desperate attempt to get them off, all to no avail. His muscles were burning from the effort. His chest heaved as he tried to breathe. Suddenly, the weight atop him felt lighter. One after another, the goblins were pulled off. He struggled to his feet and picked up his sword, which had fallen out of his grasp. A decomposed corpse was fighting the goblins. He didn't have time to question what was happening, for one of the goblins was running toward the necromancer. Broderick forced his feet to obey him and ran after the creature. He yelled a warning, but she didn't seem to hear him. She appeared to be in some sort of trance. The goblin raised its wicked-looking blade and was about to drive it into her, but Broderick lunged forward and threw himself bodily into the creature. They crashed to the ground in a heap of thrashing fists. The goblin bit his hand that held the sword. Pain caused him to jerk his hand back and drop the blade. The goblin punched him in the nose and rose up quickly, trying once again to stab the necromancer. Broderick rolled onto his side and tripped the goblin with his foot. He compelled his muscles to continue working and grabbed his blade, rising and moving to stand protectively in front of the woman. Another goblin broke free of the fight, and the corpse came running, swinging its curved sword wildly. Broderick parried several swings, but had forgotten the other goblin. Sharp, agonizing pain shot up his left arm. He saw he had inadvertently stepped back into the other goblin's swing, unknowingly saving the life of the necromancer. His anger burned through the pain, and he lashed out with his foot, kicking the goblin that stabbed him in the groin. The creature crumpled to the ground, clutching itself. He turned back, expecting to be assailed by the other goblin. They had all taken flight. The walking corpse had killed one and left another seriously injured. It lay in a puddle of its own blood, clutching a wound that kept bleeding. "Cowards!" he grunted. The corpse disintegrated into dust before his eyes, and he turned to see the necromancer looking at him with a concerned look on her face. "You're bleeding," she said. He shrugged. "It's nothing. I've done worse to myself with an axe and a tree," he laughed. For all his bluster, the pain was excruciating. She didn't press the issue. "You saved my life," she said instead. "Thank you." "I stepped into the blow accidentally," he responded grimly. "Not saying I wouldn't have done it intentionally, though." She stepped close and looked at his arm. "I should treat it anyway. Goblin blades are usually dipped in poison." "We don't have time," he replied. He slid the blade into his belt and wrapped his hand around the wound. "They're gone now, but they'll be back with more of their kind." She waved away his words. "We will make time." She led him to the horse and retrieved her bag, and withdrew a few long, slender leaves that smelled strongly of mint. "What is that?" Broderick asked. "Wintergreen," she answered, "also known as King's Cure." She put one of the leaves into her mouth and chewed it up, then spat it into her hand and told him to move his hand. She wiped the wound with the cuff of her robes and applied the chewed leaf onto the wound. She repeated this until the wound was fully covered. To Broderick's surprise, the leaves didn't sting his flesh. If anything, he felt as though they were lessening the burning in his arm. "Thanks," he said, looking over her work before she wrapped his arm up. "It's nothing," she said with a smile. He untied the reins of his horse. "We should get moving before the goblins decide to come back." When the goblins returned with reinforcements, they found the campsite long abandoned. All right. That's it for this week. That was a long chapter, so almost 18 minutes, but thank you for listening. Hope you guys are enjoying the story, and we'll be back next week with the next chapter. See you guys.